This is Jay Dyer from Jay's Analysis. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. Esoteric Hollywood is where I deconstruct the biggest films in an unparalleled way, from the classics of the silver screen to today's blockbusters. Learn to watch film with new eyes as we enter Esoteric Hollywood. Of course, I intended this to be a video of me and my attractive visage confronting you as we did the last time, but I've just not been up to it. I've been under the weather lately, so this is going to be another one of those me talking over stock footage type things where I feel like Ed Wood here or something. I'm like, no, I'm not cross-dressing, by the way, with that Ed Wood reference, but so we're going to talk about ancient philosophy and the origins of philosophy, how all cultures ultimately have done philosophy. And I thought that would be good to lay the groundwork before we do more Aristotle, or excuse me, we haven't done Aristotle yet. Before we do more modern philosophy and more Plato and more of the Greeks. You know, we did Stoicism and Marcus Aurelius last time. I think this time it would be helpful to, there's Bob Ross, by the way, the Greek version of Bob Rossostopoulos. I thought it would be helpful to go back and look at kind of the ultimate big questions of philosophy in the ancient world. And yes, we're going to get into, of course, the Greeks and how the Greeks were kind of like the next stage of philosophy, you might say, from out of the ancient world into asking real hardcore questions that began to separate the questions of existence and philosophy and so forth from the gods. So the secular, so to speak, turn that often happens in cultures at some point, according to Spangler, really was kicked off, I think you could argue, by the Greeks, because as we know from Plato and dialogues and the talks that we've done from dialogues, you have Plato saying basically that the gods they're not necessary to know or to understand what virtue is, right? So is justice just because the gods will it, or do the gods will it because it's just, right? And you come to the conclusion in Plato, and this is where we get kind of the rationalist turn in Plato, where we don't need the gods, precisely because we can come to a conception of justice without these danged gods, right? So I thought, though, I need to go back and do a little more fundamental questions of philosophy. Now, this is not going to be totally basic for beginner level type stuff. It's going to be somewhat, of a blend of both. So hopefully it's not going to bore anybody who's somewhat philosophically literate. If we talk about ancient history and developing a worldview or doing philosophy, the question rises, like, what is the meaning of history, right? So how is there a pattern to history? Does it have some sort of regularity, some way that we can study it or know about it? Or is it just one damn thing after another? Is it just a chaos falling through the void? And as we see, we get to the atomists, right? We're going to talk about the atomists of Greece, Democritus and so forth. When we get to the atomists, we're going to see how doing a philosophy of history doesn't really even make sense, right? I mean, atomism is important because it's kind of the predominant view of the world in our day, right? Matt, what is the world? Well, it's just Darwinian flux, atoms in motion. And that's really what constitutes the totality of reality. And there's nothing beyond that, ultimately. So atomism would have long-lasting, perennial, unfortunately, influence. And what's going to be neat is that when we look at atomism, we're going to see how it's still just as ridiculous as it was then. It's no different. But before we do that, and again, this is going to be, Western philosophy. We're not going to, at this stage at least, go deep into the metaphysics of like Egyptian philosophy, but we will touch on some of that because it is relevant. But so why is history meaningful? Well, history is meaningful. You can do a philosophy of history if, I would argue, if there is a God who within which worldview providence makes sense, right? So if God exists, and the God that I mean, in terms of our worldview, if he exists, then it makes sense how there could be, or why there would be, something like the doctrine of providence, which is the idea that the events of history unfold within the plan of God. God directs history. He makes sure that it comes out to his, I hope these aren't gay dudes here. He makes sure that it comes out to his desired purposes, according to his desired purposes, and we know this because of revelation. Right? We know this because that's the doctrine that's revealed in the law, in the prophets, in Proverbs, in many texts where we have explicit statements about the providence of God. Right? Proverbs, for example, says, "The lot is cast into the lap, but the whole disposing thereof is of the Lord." So history has meaning because it's not just random shit. It's not just one damn thing after another. It's actually every event, every molecule, every aspect of reality is deeply meaningful because of its relations that it shares with all the other aspects of created reality, and ultimately because behind that created reality is the mind of the Creator. So for us, as we said, history is meaningful because in the big picture, it's for us at least, it's the story of redemption. It's the story of man's fall and man's repair by God, and that repair is ultimately about the restoring of man to a higher state than he was even in Eden. So it's not just sound and fury signifying nothing, but in a worldview where you just have sort of materialism and random chaos, it really is one damn thing after another. It really is sound and fury signifying nothing. If everything is random, then how could you do philosophy, quote unquote? Why would you do how could you do history? Right? Because doing history or doing philosophy assumes a lot of these ideas and categories like language, or going to the library and you're going to read books about some ancient culture or something like this, and it assumes that there's some meaning, right, obviously, that underlies the words that you're reading, that you can understand something about what happened 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years ago through the medium of some symbol, and by that I mean the words in a book. So that's only possible if the world is a certain way. If the world is pure chaos, doesn't really seem like it's possible to do that, is what I'm trying to say, right? To be able to encapsulate ideas in little symbols written on parchment, vellum, or script, right? But we are able to do that. So man's mind then is able, of course, to decode these symbols in these written forms. And how is it able to do that? Of course, if everything is just relative, it's not, right? And this is why you'll get like a liberal version of history or a Marxist version of history where they try to read this meaning, whatever their presupposition is. If it's a Marxist, it's the class struggle throughout history all the way back into the ancient world. It's all class warfare. But the problem with that is that Marxism is always, across the board, built on materialism and flux. And this is what Trotsky, this is what Lenin write. Lenin has a whole book on empirico-materialism that he wrote. And so if the world is empirico-materialism, then you don't really find meaning, right? There's no actual meaning in class warfare. Meaning is purely imposed subjectively from the individual's tastes, preferences, and psyche or whatever, right? It's not something that's found out there in the world. And if that's the case, well, then who cares? It doesn't matter whether the bourgeoisie has stamped their boot on the proletariat. It doesn't matter whether the proletariat overthrows the bourgeoisie and sets up a dictatorship of the proletariat. None of that stuff matters. It's meaningless on that worldview. So, and this is what you'll find when you actually, if you go to university and you take a class maybe that deals with history, philosophy of history, how to do history, this kind of stuff, which I had all those courses. I'm like one or two classes from a double major in history and philosophy. And given that I've probably read, I don't know, 20 times more than most of the other people who were actual history grads, I could go ahead and probably say that I have a double major in philosophy and history safely, even though it's not technically true. It might as well be. I've read a lot more than all those people. So we can go ahead and say, I have experience in this. I know how academia is going to treat history. I know how to do historiography and all this kind of stuff. And what you'll get is you'll get exposed to these different schools. You'll get exposed to Howard Zinn and the idea of the people's history, and you'll get exposed to a Marxist reading of history. And nowadays, of course, there's the feminist liberation reading of history, and it's all just total nonsense. It's just total nonsense. It's weaponized academia, really. Weaponized philosophy by design. And it's all based, again, as we said, on the idea of a faith commitment. And this is why I often talk about presuppositions, because I don't care what your view is or how rational or, quote, scientific you think your view is. At some point in your belief system or worldview, you're still going to have faith commitments, or you're still going to have some level of circularity at the most foundational, basic level of what you believe. If you believe that all reality is Marxist class struggle and dialectical tension, and that all of history, as you go back and read history, is merely class struggle, then the problem is that you yourself, there's different ways we could critique that, but we would have to say that, if you're in academia and you are coming to learn this, and you've spent $50,000-$60,000 on a college education, and then you go into grad school, aren't you part of the bourgeoisie? Aren't you part of the pseudo academic class, right, that might be oppressing the underclass in the maybe classic or Marxist type of scheme? And if that's the case, then how is it that you somehow speak for the underclass? Well, of course, we know that's all a bunch of gobbledygook, but what I'm saying is, how is it that you think that you've come to this truth about class warfare, given the fact that the entirety of the Marxist position classifies everything under class warfare? So you yourself are merely a product of that class warfare. Now, of course, Marxism would say, that's just part of the dialectic. That's just part of the insanity and madness and contradictions that are reality or whatever. But again, what the point I'm getting at is that it requires a faith commitment. It requires the starting point, the presupposition that all reality is classed and all history is classed under class warfare and dialectical tension, right? So once you have that starting point, everything else is launched from there. So what we want to do then is consider the two different possible worldviews or approaches that an unbelieving perspective would have: a materialist perspective, scientism, these types of views, as opposed to one where there's meaning in history through divine providence. And that will take us, as I said briefly, into looking at kind of the overview of Egyptian philosophy. Now, what we're going to see is that in most philosophies, there's a dialectical tension. And they're not very good at resolving those dialectical tensions, generally speaking. For us, man exists under God in this world. He's made in the image of God. He's a being who is, unfortunately, because of the fall, in rebellion. And so he seeks through various means, be it esoteric, be it scientific, be it mystical, be it Dionysian drug-fueled binges and benders and so forth. He seeks to find meaning and a different way to live in this world, beyond and outside of what we believe is revealed divine law. And the ancient cultures, the esoteric societies and so forth, represent all the different machinations and technologies by which man has tried to live outside of this divine revelation. That's at least our perspective, or my perspective. And as I said, I will eventually probably try to do the entirety of the City of God. And this is the way St. Augustine presents it. Obviously now, as myself being Orthodox, I don't really have him in the same perspective of honor and hero worship as I did back when I was in my 20s. I wanted to be St. Augustine. I read City of God when I was 21. And it still has stuck with me, though. The message and meaning of that book is that ancient cultures, ancient societies represent what we see in the book of Exodus, right? Exodus presents God's people versus Egypt and the mysteries of Egypt. And Moses was someone, who, for example, who knew all the mysteries of Egypt, as the text says, but God eventually called him back into following the revelation that God had given to his people, the Jews, the Hebrews, right? And that at that time was the true revelation of God. That was the true church at that time. And that was the city of God over against the city of man, as Augustine describes it in his City of God, his famous book. And that is, simply put, that's our model for world history, for the philosophy of history, and for philosophy. Philosophy represents the highest attempts of a secular man to make his own path in the world. And by extension, for a lot of people at least, the limitations of, quote, secularism, a lot of people realize those limitations. And so they might be drawn into esoteric or occult societies. And I don't believe that those really have any answers. They might have a little more depth than something stupid like materialism or Darwinian evolution. You might get a little more sophistication. They might be able to peer a little bit into the psychosphere, so to speak, but they still don't really have coherent examples, because ultimately it's esotericism really just ends up being one individual guy's masturbatory trek into madness, really. Is what happens to most of these people. I mean, and I mean, how is it clear exactly which path is true? I mean, the whole idea here, of course, of that path is that, or that presupposition is that the path that you're on is true, whether you're following Frithjof Schuon, or whether you're following Crowley, or whether you're following, I don't know, pick any of the mystical schools. It's not really a coherent presentation. Perennial philosophy is really as far as you could get within that stuff, I would say. But rather, and I think a lot of the reason I would not be a perennialist or traditionalist or any of that is because a lot of those problems that are going to be in the worldview that we've already been critiquing, right? The kind of secular or unbelieving or materialist or agnostic, atheist type view of history, a lot of those same dialectical tensions are going to pass over into the mystical and esoteric doctrines. So, for example, there will be the tendency or the dialectical tension between the totality of reality being rational and that there's coherent order and meaning out there in the world, and that nature is governed by regularity, principle of induction, and so forth. And that's going to be set over against the idea of ultimate irrationality, right? That the universe is just a explosion of Big Bang into random molecules and atoms bouncing off of everything, and it's just chaos and sound and fury, signifying nothing. So these two tensions are quite often, I would say 99% of the time, usually held by people who do not believe the biblical revelation, for example. They will incoherently hold to both of these ideas in their worldview, and that we would say is a dialectical tension. It can't be both. The universe can't be completely chaotic at the highest level and random, and life random and chaotic, and at the same time a universe that's ordered and based on regularity and principles of meaning and so forth, objectivity. So, generally speaking, the unbelieving or the materialist or atheist or whatever you want to call it, secular approach, they smush rationality into irrationality. They try to have both at the same time. Have their rational cake and their irrational cake and eating it together at once. And this manifests, I guess, as you could say, in many different ways too, because you'll get the dialectic of unity versus diversity. This is kind of the basic questions Plato asked. What's more fundamental to reality? Particularity and the many? Is that more fundamental? Is that given ontological priority? Or is monism, is a giant glob of everything melding into one, the real reality, right? And again, these are the basic dialectical tensions that are going to be everywhere. And once you see it, you notice it everywhere. There's another dialectic that often pops up between permanence and change. What is more fundamental to reality? Is it everything in flux, as some of the early Greeks and pre-Socratics would say, right? Or is it everything in permanence, right? Parmenides. Or is it all flux, Heraclitus? Right. So dialectical tensions there that cannot be resolved. Is change just merely an illusion and everything is in a pure state of stasis? Right. This is something that Zeno would argue, right, with his Zeno's paradox. Since you could infinitely subdivide reality or movement or distance between two objects, it stands to reason that there is no such thing as space. Space is illusory. And since space is illusory, it follows that change is illusory. Or so goes Zeno's paradox. As we said, unity versus diversity, or monism versus atomism. This is another angle on this argument. What's more fundamental to reality? That all of reality is tiny little bitty invisible dots, monads? Or is the fundamental reality all one giant blob of monism, of oneness? Are these two ideas in perpetual eternal tension? These are the problems that will never ever be reconciled in any of these secular philosophies. And then what you have basically in the esoteric philosophies is the realization of some of these problems and then the attempt to answer these problems while still remaining within the dialectics. So, for example, for us, the Trinity, the triune God, is the equal ultimacy of one and many. The one and the many are equally ultimate in the supreme reality of God, and they are really distinct, right? The Father, the Son, and the Spirit are really distinct from one another. They share one singular divine nature, right, which is truly one. They're not three gods, and there's not a abyss of absolute divine simplicity into a monad into which all distinction disappears. We don't believe either of those things. We believe in the equal ultimacy of the one and the many in the triad, in the Orthodox view. Now, that, I would say, in our view, because our ultimate highest principle reconciles all those things, that actually cancels out all the other worldviews. Because even something like Neoplatonism, in Neoplatonism you still have the primacy of oneness, the monad. Everything is striving to get back to the monad because of this fractured multiplicity that happened at some point, right? Which is like the Neoplatonic view of the fall or something, which makes absolutely no sense. We have no idea why this happened or what would have caused multiplicity. But in our view, there's no tension between the one and the many, right? Universals and particulars are not in dialectical tension from one another, as they are in Platonism and as they are in ancient Far Eastern thought, and even in Egyptian thought as well, if you read the Hermetica. Other dialectics arise too that are also connected to the ones I've already mentioned. For example, we mentioned the dialectic of permanence versus change. Another angle on that one is freedom or determinism. If the universe is a giant mechanistic machine or a giant blob, then free will is really an illusion. Your choices, your actions are really just an eternal series, an eternal chain, a chain of events that determine your actions presently. And if that's the case, then there is no actual responsibility. There's no such thing as volition. There's no free choice. There's also no responsibility, by the way. You're not responsible for your crimes or actions. You were just predetermined to do that by an infinite chain of material events and chemical reactions. But yet, at the same time, secular, non-believing, and even esoteric worldviews want to have the idea of freedom. I'm free, man. Free will, man. You can't tell me what to do. Yeah, I evolved out of muck and goo 1 billion years ago, but I'm a free individual. Are you? Well, how are you an individual? What does that mean? What does it mean to be a self? Right? Because a self is not something you find under a microscope. So which is it? Do we want scientism and rationality? Do we want strict empiricism? Or do we want idealism? Do we want ideal reality being something beyond the here and the now and the flux? Right? This is a dialectic. Plato versus Aristotle. Right? Plato's idealism versus Aristotle's empiricism. These are dialectical tensions, and the whole history of Western philosophy is built on dialectical tensions. That's why we would say revelation comes in as the real answer and solution to all these problems. Now, we'll get to that later. That's not really the subject of this week's talk. It's not about revelation or justifying revelation, but I'm just pointing out that you will find the patterns in the non-believing, the worldviews that reject any notion of revelation. Really, the only thing if you don't believe in this revelation, by default, pretty much every other worldview tends to some kind of Platonism or some kind of Far Eastern idea. That's really the only other option, and that's the historical tendency is always in that direction. So whether it's ancient Egypt or whether it's the Greeks, and I understand that there were differences between the thought of the ancient Egyptians and the Greeks, but regardless, you're still ultimately searching for a higher principle and absolute that is beyond the material world, that is impersonal, is what it amounts to. You might could argue that Egyptian absolute reality is in some sense personal, but I tend to believe that what makes the most sense, and nobody believes this because they don't believe the Bible, but nobody believes that Jewish theology influenced the Egyptians. But I think that's the most sensible notion, given the fact that Abraham and Joseph, right, spent time sojourning in Egypt, as the Bible tells us. And Joseph was even raised to, right next to Pharaoh. So that to me would suggest, because they were prophets, both Abraham and Joseph, that would suggest that they influenced Egyptian theology. So everybody wonders about this mysterious period in Egyptology, Egyptian history, where they became monotheists. Well, stands to reason that they were probably taught by the Jewish prophets. But of course, that would mean that the Bible was true, and well, we can't have that, right? There's just no way. But that's a whole other debated topic. We're just talking about the philosophy of history here, right? And then we're kind of running here and there, having little discussions, and our mind is free associating here. But what is philosophy then? Well, philosophy is the process of seeking to answer these dialectical tensions that I mentioned. Okay. Now, what modern philosophy I'm saying? Modern philosophy of the West. It seeks to either reconcile or admit that there's no reconciliation, or answer or not answer all of those things that I've listed. Right, the struggle of the internal contradictions within a worldview, the permanence or change, monism versus atomism, universals versus particulars, freedom versus determinism, transcendence versus finitude, right? All of these kinds of things. And so philosophy then is man seeking to understand, I think you could say, the world around him. It's man seeking explanations, exegesis of the world, of reality. How does this happen? Why does this happen? And so philosophy, epistemologically speaking, then becomes an attempt to justify one's beliefs or thought, resolving internal contradictions. Philosophy is, I would say, man's desire. Of course, we know the word means love of wisdom, right? Philosophia. Man's desire to also understand the external world, right? The inner world and the outer world. The inner world being the psyche and the soul, and man's desire to understand the outer world, right? The cosmos, the biological realm of nature and so forth. What is the stuff of reality? What makes up reality? What is out there? Can we know? How do things change? What causes change? Is there identity over time? This is a big issue. I forgot to mention this one too. The question of identity over time in the dialectical tensions position, because this is a serious problem for any of the secular type views, or even the esoteric type views as well. Because most of the time an object is defined by the properties that it possesses, what are in philosophy sometimes called secondary qualities, right? So what is the tree? Well, the tree is just the fact that it has X amount of leaves, it's got bark, it's brown, it's got these green leaves, etc. So you list all these properties of this tree, and you say that all together, add them all up, equals tree, or equals that tree. But the problem, of course, is that what happens when it starts to lose those leaves? What happens when it eventually drops maybe half of its, maybe the loggers, Paul Bunyan comes along and he saws off half of the tree because he just thought it would be funny to have a half tree there or something. Is it the same tree? Well, it's not the same tree if your definition of a tree or explanation of what that tree is or was is merely the sum total of its parts. Then you see this is a problem. But of course, all of this has been tossed out by the kind of secular philosophy we're talking about. And they don't really care about any of that stuff anymore. Well, because they don't have any answers, right? So what do you do when you're Neil deGrasse Tyson, and you can't answer or those kinds of questions propose very difficult issues for your worldview, well, you just set them aside and say philosophy is useless. Who cares? I don't want that. All right, I do science, supposedly, right? Said atomism is one trek that is usually taken. The other option is monism or monophysitism, which is the idea that there's really only one nature that's out there. And in ancient Greece, you see this, or excuse me, ancient Egypt, as we said, you have this kind of pyramid. The reason for the pyramid is not just a bunch of occult gobbledygook, but because Pharaoh represents the incarnation of Ra. He is Atum Ra in the flesh. And so the pyramid, at the base of the pyramid, what you have is nature, and the pyramid represents the whole universe, the cosmos, and the spiritual realm. And then the next level of that pyramid would be man, and then going up the pyramid would be the gods, and then Ra, or the divine nature, or Atum, at the very, very top. And so that perfection and unity, the ultimate oneness, the closer that you move up the pyramid, the closer you get to the one, to the monad. And this is, of course, as we know from the Timaeus of Plato, the overall scheme, or background metaphysic, I guess you could say, that informs Platonism. And looking at my notes here. Yeah, so basically what we have is that the gods and man and the rest of the world, in this view, metaphysically speaking, are all the same stuff. Godness. We're all sparks of the divine. We're all just stars. We're all stardust, right? This is what Lawrence Krauss says directly from Crowley, that we all just sort of were birthed from some exploding champagne supernova that Oasis sang about. So the state then comes to reflect nature in this view, insofar as it is the incarnation of God on earth. And this is what Hegel would later say, right? Thousands of years later, in this same dialectical morass, Hegel would go on to say that the state is the march of God within history. And of course, our view is something quite different. We do not believe in the state as the incarnation of God or a reflection of the divine principles of nature, pantheism, or anything like that. And ultimately, this is all pantheism, right? Monism is pantheism, etc., etc. These all kind of blend into one. And really, in all of these views, you only have two options. You can either fall back into monism, or you can fall into some kind of dualism. And this is the dialectic that you see in a lot of Far Eastern thought, which is that the ultimate principle of all reality is either one, as we said earlier with Platonism, or it's just chaotic atomism, everything in discrete packs of atoms and chemical reactions all warring against each other. And it's just an eternal flux, right? But in these, well, I guess you might call high statist views of like ancient Egypt, or these big imperial civilizations of the pagan world, the idea is that at the top of the pyramid, you're closest to the gods, because those are the god people, right? Caesar is the god man, and Caesar will be a kind of incarnation of what we're talking about with Egypt, because the tradition of Egypt passes into Greece, and then the tradition of the Greeks morphs into the Romans, right? And we all know this. We know that this is why the Roman gods are just basically adoptions of the Greek gods and the traditions of Homer, right? And the Iliad and all that, the Odyssey. But at base is a philosophy and a metaphysic of oneness or monism in all of these views. And this is going to be crucial, because this is going to distinguish our view of creation and why we believe that the created world is unique, matter is unique in our view because history has a beginning, a middle, and a terminus. It has this three-stage process to it that makes it meaningful. And I think that beginning, middle, and an end to all history is absolutely necessary, actually, for cognition, for understanding man, for understanding history. You actually have to have this precondition, this transcendental conception of beginning, middle, and end, because we're just constituted that way as humans. We are just so constituted, right? All of our language is sentences that have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and this is how we convey meaning. Our lives are experienced in beginnings, middles, and ends, and we are always, obviously, only in the present, but we don't, by that fact, say that the past was fake, it was an illusion. The history that I experienced was not an illusion, it was real. The history of the world is real. The present is real. It's not Maya, it's not illusion. It's going somewhere. And the history of the world is not illusory. The present world is not illusory, and it is going somewhere. And so because there is a beginning, middle, and an end, because creation has a starting point, it has meaning. And in this sense, I think that this is why our worldview, the Orthodox view, is unique. And now, even if you disagree with me, that's fine. You're still going to, I think, get a good education into, the ancient philosophical underlying positions here. And so even if you disagree with me, if you were to read a standard treatment from the academic realm, they're going to be saying a lot of the same things. So it's not like everything you're hearing from me is an apologetic. And in fact, again, they're going to be trying to convince you of a totally random, chaotic universe, right? With, as we said, the dialectical tensions in their views. So if we think about the biblical period and how it relates to the Greeks, there's a lot of contemporaneous figures and characters. So Abraham is probably roughly 2000 BC. If you read Genesis, and Abraham comes up in like Genesis 12 and Genesis 15 and 17 and 22. Those are the key Abrahamic chapters. The Exodus roughly probably was around 1400 BC, right? The book of Exodus with Moses and the Jews leaving Egypt. And so we believe what's unique about our revelation to the prophets, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the Torah. What's unique is that there was a biblical monotheism that was personal before there was the idea of polytheism, right? Polytheism generally in the liberal academic or the the comparative religion circles, they always say, there was this evolution of man from primitive being into concocting animism, right? He started worshiping the sticks and the rocks and the streams, and then he graduated from that into the gods up in Mount Olympus, up in the sky or on the top of the mountain, and then he graduated from that into monotheism, and the Jewish prophets brought us monotheism. That was a new evolution and revolution in the history of man. And then the Greeks came, and the Greeks taught us rationalism and reason and secularism. And then the heroes of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance taught us science. Right? This is the typical standard secular Auguste Comte sort of characterization of how human history has operated. Right? They have their own version of giving it meaning, of man supposedly progressing through these stages towards rationalism and progress, quote unquote. Of course, we never exactly hear what progress is. We just hear this. Progress is never exactly explained. It's just always this vague sort of propaganda notion that is really more so employed by the state and oligarchs than it is anything with any content. I mean, I believe there is progress, but in my worldview, progress is something radically different than the progress of somebody like Toynbee or the progress of Richard Dawkins. So philosophy begins, we would say, in Genesis, when you have Adam and Eve and you have a state of divine communion with God, the Creator, and we believe the Logos is the Creator there in Genesis. And so in our view, man is born into a world that already has objective metaphysics and structures and meaning and order and ethics. And so man's not autonomous. Man doesn't have the ability or power to construct entire whole views that will actually work in the world. Now, man does this. I'm not saying he doesn't actually do it. But because of the fall, because of free will and Adam and Eve being cast out of the divine communion, we're now subject to death. But in Genesis, you have what's called the proto-evangelium in Genesis 3, the promise of the seed coming through the line of Seth and Abel, right, on down into the Davidic line and into the birth of Jesus, who is the seed that's mentioned there, we believe. The descendant of David, right, the vine of David, who will be the Messiah, who is God himself, right, the second person of the Godhead. So we believe that there was a biblical worldview. In our perspective, because of Revelation, we take this account of history to be the explanation for man's origins. And you have to start there, because if for example, if there's not creation, if it's not ex nihilo, out of nothing creation, which is the biblical view and the view of the Orthodox Church for the last 2,000 years, if it's not that, then you've got all of these other problems philosophically that will arise. For example, if all of reality is eternal recurrence, as Nietzsche or the ancient Greeks said, for example, because they didn't believe in creation and they didn't believe in an end to history, there's no beginning, middle, and end, then all of the phenomena that we're experiencing now presently is just an eternal recurrence that you pretty much need to escape from, because you're going to get old and die and you're going to be unhappy. So the wheel of time that you need to escape through, this is just the ancient Hindu idea. This is conditioned by the view of time and space, because of there not being creation. So when matter is eternal and when the demiurge just stamps form and forms matter, right, with a form, as Plato taught, then there's no real explanation or need or goodness in this world. It becomes a prison. This world is the prison. You got to flee from it. You got to escape it. But it's very hard to live that way because there's a lot of good things in the world, aren't there? Right? So it seems to run counter to our very being to say that the world, physicality, pleasures, all of these things are bad, right? And then that view, to be consistent, leads to even more ridiculous ideas that, well, if all that's bad, then so is the self. You're bad because you're part of this instantiated historical phenomena, and since all that's bad, quote unquote, then you need to escape the badness, escape the particularity, and dissolve into the infinite, dissolve into the abyss, dissolve into thusness. So there's this ultimate idea of just basically destruction of the self, which goes under the guise of destroying the ego as some sort of humble enlightenment, but it's not. It's suicidal, it's self-destructive, and it's demonic, we would say. So the biblical worldview presents something very different. A personal God. God is personal. He's a creator. He creates the world according to logos and reason. However, the created order has been disrupted by the fall of man. Man was situated as the steward of creation and disrupted that communion between the created order and the creator by his fall, by his rebellion. And as a result, we all experience death. So, if we were to think of Thales, the famous Greek character, Thales is about 580 BC. And philosophy for the Greeks, we could roughly date around 600 BC. So around the time of Thales, and then into the pre-Socratics. And so you're going to get from the city of man, from the Greeks, the idea that the light of reason, the light of man's just natural faculties, is competent, capable, and in every way possible. Right? He's able to construct a human society that is ordered and meaningful and virtuous and so forth and so on. A city-state, without the need of God. Now, interestingly, this is actually Babel. If you read the story of the Tower of Babel, isn't it? Yes, it's the same story throughout history, on and on and on. Babel just kind of repeats and reinstantiates itself from back in Genesis 10 and 11 up until now with the EU. Right? It's just another, and the UN, just Babel all over again. We can create a world order. We don't need God. We don't need your revelation. We don't need the transcendent. We just need man's reason. And this is really the idea that the Greeks pioneer for the West. Now, I'm not saying all the Greek philosophy is all bad. I'm not saying that at all. Obviously, I don't believe that. I've done many lectures on this. We get all kinds of ideas from Greek philosophy that are good, but we don't know where those came from. Right? We have the ideas of geometry and Pythagoreanism and mathematics and math theory and logic, right? Aristotle, but the narrative, the story is, oh, well, they just sat around and pondered and dreamt all this stuff up. Or Solon got it from the priests of Egypt. Well, where did the priests of Egypt get the knowledge of mathematics and geometry and architecture? Well, I guess they got it from the civilization before them, the Indo-Aryan. And so, okay, well, where'd they get it? Well, who knows? See, we don't know. That's the thing. And the problem is that so-called science, so-called academia, which is all contradictory and lies and makes up crap and is all the time shown to be fraudulent, quite often, not everybody, but quite often, they don't have a coherent presentation. They don't know. They're just telling you that they know because it's partly a confidence game. And then everybody goes into this academic structure and thinks, oh, well, we've got it all figured out. The civilizations are millions of years old or 100,000 years old. No, they don't know. They're just saying that. So as we said, philosophy then, what is it? Well, philosophy is, in one sense, analytical, in that it examines. It is interested also in being intuitive, because we aren't just calculators. We also experience creativity. We also experience inspiration, which is an overlooked aspect of philosophy. But that's because, of course, again, men go into philosophy in the realm of academics and they want to make a name for themselves and they want to get funding and they want this and that, and to be hailed as the inventor of some new great school or movement, or they want to be the next Jean-Paul Sartre, they want to be the next Nietzsche. And it's just futility and vanity of vanities, as Solomon says in Ecclesiastes. So, but what I'm getting at then is that there's kind of a piece of truth, and it's I guess you could say a graded scale maybe, of usefulness in all the different schools of philosophy. So, is Nietzsche good or useful? Well, parts of Nietzsche are insightful. What about Jean-Paul Sartre? Well, not that great, but there might be some interesting insights if you read maybe some of Sartre's fiction or something. But the point being that we don't, from that, conclude that, oh, well, then there's one guy, right, who's our prophet figure, who's going to lead us, because they were humans. At least that's our belief. So regardless of their insights, they're still men, and they're still just speaking into the void, right? Sound and fury signifying nothing. And so what we want to do as philosophers is be analytical. We also want to listen to our intuitive sense. We also want to be sensitive to the idea of creative thinking in philosophy. It's not just math. It's not just logic. It's not just, giving some factual account of something. It's going to involve all of these things. And at least in our view, it involves the initiatory process, theologically speaking, that goes beyond just something rational or intellectual. Right? And so ultimately for us, knowledge is revelational. It is supernatural. It's transcendent. But that does not mean that it's irrational, however. It just means that it's supra-rational at base and at its foundation. Doesn't mean we don't do theology in a rational, sensible, or logical way. Many theological texts are written that way. The ones that I've done talks on, St. John of Damascus, for example, the Logos and the Logoi of St. Maximus Confessor. Those are all very rational theologies at one level. But reason, human reason, the faculty of reason, deified by God, illuminated by God, leads us into higher realms of thinking. And that's really what we're shooting for here. So philosophy doesn't just function as some sort of secular natural process or pursuit. It has as its end goal logos, logic, or truth, or God. And so in that way, we can't be purely left brain or purely right brain, purely analytical or purely intuitive. And so we're looking at a worldview when it comes to philosophy, and this is basically just how we view the world, the web of beliefs, the network of our belief systems, our belief system that we have, our foundational presuppositions. Does God exist or does he not? Is there an external world or is it all illusion? Right? I mean, that may sound silly, but a lot of people believe that the external world is an illusion. There's a lot of religious views that believe that. Is there right and wrong? Is it all relative? Does it matter? Should you just live for pleasure? Is it bad to live for pleasure? Right? I mean, these are all the questions of philosophy that when we live our daily lives, we're operating on the basis of a worldview, of presuppositional commitments, faith commitments. And so a network of presuppositions, I would say, is really just man's praxis, the way man lives in the world, and his operating system, I guess, is the best way you could use the computer analogy, right? So knowledge and experience is interrelated. There's no, I wouldn't say that there's, some artificial dialectical divide. This is another dialectic that comes up in history. The history of philosophy, especially in the West, is the dialectic between ideas and thought and form and math and this kind of stuff versus the external world and empirical experience. There's no divide or dialectical tension there other than what is foisted upon those two realms, the inner world, the outer world, by fallen man, by man who seeks to further dialectical tensions, ultimately. So, speaking then of worldviews and presuppositions, what I mean by a presupposition, to be clear, is the idea of an elementary assumption, a basic commitment, a foundational perspective, right? A starting point. And I would say that they are not precognitive. That is, let's put it this way. One of the basic concerns of epistemology, of philosophy, is epistemology, which is going to be the question of how do we know, what do we know, can we justify our beliefs? And what I'm getting at here is that a presupposition, strictly speaking, does not admit of, quote, justification in the way that many things do admit of justification. So, for example, if we wanted to justify our belief in whether or not Lil Wayne is in the backyard right now. Is Lil Wayne in the backyard right now, dog? I don't know, but he's probably not. So I have a strong, warranted belief that Lil Wayne is not presently hanging out back and sipping purple drink. But do I know that with absolute certainty? No, because I have not looked out back and to see what's going on out in the yard. You know, could be Jazzy Jeff and Fresh Prince back there, right? Might not be Lil Wayne. But until I get up and go and check with my eyes and see is Lil Wayne out in the backyard, I don't have the same level of certitude as I do with just the very, very likely opinion, a belief, very highly warranted belief that Lil Wayne's probably not back in the backyard right now. So let's say I go and check. You know, maybe even I hear some beats bumping out back. I go and look. Is Lil Wayne back there? Is it Jazzy Jeff? No, it was the cow. The cows are back there bumping against the shed. And it's cow mating season right now. And they're making some noise. And it sounded like there was some bass. So it was actually the cows. Now I have a higher level certitude, right? 99.9% certitude, probably, that's very likely, that the cows are the ones making the bumping bass noise out back, getting jiggy with it, and not Will Smith and not Lil Wayne. So then I come back in and I sit back down to talk to you about philosophy, and then I started thinking, I start doubting myself, and I said, well, now, wait a minute. I'm 99.9% certain, but can I say that I have total certainty, absolute certitude that Lil Wayne was in the backyard? Maybe Lil Wayne was in the barn rapping at the same time as the cows were banging up against the wall of the barn and making noise that sounded like bass, right? So you see, I can keep questioning in my silly analogy here, my silly example. There's always in the empirical realm some degree or possibility, even if it's very minuscule, 0.00001% chance that Lil Wayne was out in the barn making beats, getting dope, getting fly and fresh, laying down that flow, right? So, but again, we don't. There's a difference between the kind of certainty that, say, 2 + 2 = 4, right? That level of certainty is even still greater, we would say, and probably Plato would say this too, right, than even the highest level of certitude that you could gain from any empirical endeavor, right? Even the question of, will the sun rise tomorrow? And this is a question David Hume poses, right? He says, if you're an empiricist, you haven't actually empirically experienced what's going to happen tomorrow. So do you know for certain that the sun will rise tomorrow? Well, we can have a pretty good idea that the sun's going to rise tomorrow because it always has. But there's still some chance that, maybe tomorrow the quantum foam gets a little sloshy, or maybe Lil Wayne sloshes around in the quantum foam of his purple drink, and it causes a rupture in the fabric of time-space, and the sun doesn't rise anymore tomorrow, and we just live in a world of nighttime. It's just, for now, forever and ever and ever, it's now nighttime. Right? So, that's very unlikely. But Hume's point is, how are you ever going to have absolute certainty with a strict empiricist view? And he himself, of course, was an empiricist, but he was just illustrating the point to his fellow empiricists that you can't have strict certitude, truly, honestly, and clearly, certainly speaking, like you have certitude of 2 times 2 equaling 4. How do we know 2? Well, it's just there's actually something intuitively true about 2 times 2, or 2 plus 2 equaling 4. And on top of that, we also know that it works in the world, right? I mean, when I make change, or when somebody's making change for me, I don't feel slighted because of the sudden introduction of a new kind of mathematics where my change should no longer be, $2. It should be $1 when I'm expecting 2, right? So the world operates in some obvious, intuitive, experiential way. We know this from experience, by the way, that mathematical principles actually do work in the world. Now, how exactly all that works, quote unquote, or happens, is the question of philosophy. That's what we're doing in philosophy. So, as we said, there's all kinds of questions, all kinds of dialectical tensions that are going to pop up. And what we want to strive to do, and why is this? Well, not just because we thought it up, but we actually believe that revelation tells us, reveals to us a kind of philosophy. It's not just philosophy, but there is a kind of biblical revealed philosophy that tells us and shows us that we should not view the world as in dialectical tension. Right? There are contraries. There are, like, black and white are what we call contraries. Night and day are contrary. But we needn't impose upon that the assumption that they're somehow against one another in some sort of tension or competition. And you could see why a pagan thought might view it this way, because when you look out in the world and you see animals fighting each other, and a pack of wolves fighting another pack of wolves, well, it looks like there's real tension in the world. And so let's just expand that principle into the metaphysical, ontological planes and spheres, and it looks like, night and day must then be in tension and warring with each other, right? So the sun god wars against the moon god throughout the night, or something like this, right? But we don't believe that. We don't believe that there's tensions in the things that are natural or that God created, because everything that's created is good, as Genesis says. There's no evil inherent in creation. Evil is a privative, negative type of existence. And it's really only the move of the will away from the good. That's the only thing that evil is. It's not a, quote, thing. Evil does not possess the attribute of existence or being. It is only a negative kind of movement away from being or good, as St. Athanasius says. So, ancient cultures then that preceded Greeks, like Egypt or the Assyrians or Babylon, they had their own philosophies too. And what's interesting is that you kind of see these same patterns for a lot of these ancient civilizations. It's the patterns I mentioned a minute ago of kind of monophysitism, right? And I don't mean the Christian heresy of the 6th and 7th century. I'm talking about monophysitism in terms of monism, the idea that all reality is one kind of being, and it's all really just a pyramid. This is why all the ancient cultures have ziggurats and they have pyramids. Okay, it's not because the alien gods were teaching them how to make spaceships. It was because they had a philosophy. Now, they might have been interacting with demons. I'm not saying that's not true, but because they did do all kinds of rituals that involved drug use and then involved human sacrifice and occult traditions and so forth. And so if they were bombed out of their mind on drugs and going into altered states of consciousness, that would be my view of how they contacted the spirit realm, or the realm of the demonic. We don't know exactly how in the ancient world the celestial intelligences interacted with those cultures. We just don't know. We have statements in Genesis and the Book of Enoch that do seem to give indicators, but again, we just don't have a lot of certitude about these things, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with saying you don't know, and it's actually a much better position than the stupidity of the establishment, which constantly contradicts itself in its radical quest to always play the confidence game of pretending that they actually do know, that they have this sort of infallible certainty about all this stuff when they don't. Now, so again, that same pattern, what I was getting at is that all being, all reality, all what is in these ancient cultures, and I'm going to say, I made the radical claim that yes, aside from the biblical view, and in fact, I've read more than one secular scholar. There's a book on the history of human sacrifice that I cited in my book, Esoteric Hollywood. I can't remember the guy's name off the top of my head, but it's cited in there. It's on human sacrifice, and he admits that the Jews, the Jewish prophets, and he's not a Jew, he's not interested in biblical theology, he's not Christian or anything like that. He admits that the Jews were the only culture in the ancient world that didn't, or that fought against, or at least preached against, this tendency to sacrifice people and build giant ziggurats and kill firstborn and stuff like this, right? So you'll have to find that quote later. Again, it's in my book. Just look up the human sacrifice thing in Esoteric Hollywood. You'll find that guy's book where he talks about that. But I think I even quote that section in my book. But yes, since the world again presents predators and prey, this is another reason why you would get the elites in these different pagan cultures, claiming to be the God people. This was a great insight that Jamie actually had in her book. I think it's either in Operation Culture Creation or Hollywood Mind Control. Maybe it's Operation Culture Creation. There's a section where she talks about the ancient cultures, and the reason they worship fire is because fire would ward off predators in the night, right? So, you could kind of see why they would deify the thing that's scaring off lions and the tigers and the bears. But then the elite, or the oligarchic class, saw this and they realized, so what do men fear? Well, they fear the nature spirits. They fear the primeval lion, tiger, and bear that's going to come get you. So we could weaponize that, and then we take on the characteristics of lion, tiger, bear, predator, right? In our artwork, in our iconography, you'll see the elites mixed with animal creatures and so forth, and this is the gods. And so what do the prey? What does the king of the jungle do? Well, he eats the weaker ones. So how do we maintain our elite status? Well, we eat and sacrifice the plebes.